I am the Reading Rainbow Emperor, and today I'm talking about prose. I've been talking about prose, by the time this comes out, about 2 weeks or so. And one of the things I've been trying to do is demonstrate good prose and how it can be used to characterize, as well as show the type of world that they're in. Honestly, a lot of books these days trade action for prose. And I think that that works for, I want to say, the equivalent of a popcorn flick. It's good. It's like a Mission Impossible. You can have some real good stuff in there, but it's not the same. You see, Casablanca and Mission Impossible are still kind of spy thrillers. Not quite the same action level, of course, but they're still about spies and war and agents and clever words and not so much action, of course, in Casablanca's case, but that drama. And Mission Impossible likes to pretend it has drama sometimes. Now, one of the books that I like is Titus Groan, the first of three books in the Gormenghast series by Mervin Peake. Now, the third one's, and the second one has a 200-page party scene about professors trying to court the one single female in the entire damn castle, which is supposed to be some type of satire that I simply don't understand and don't find funny. But Titus Groan is fantastic. Not so much for any humorous reason or anything like that, but it is very absurd, as you'll see here. But rather because it's also lifelike and well described. It is a peak of sorts, as good as anything he can produce, and better than most of the books even in his own series. You see, moving from strength to strength is incredibly difficult. But something like this. Ah, that's very nice. It's often believed by some that he was in his senility um, when he wrote the third one, but the first one. Ooh. I'm going to read to you from the third chapter. It's the chapter that introduces certain characters like Swelter and Steer Pike. Antagonistic characters. We've already been introduced to Mr. Flay, the thin butler of Gormenghast, and probably as close to a point of view character we'll have in this series. We also have seen the Hall of the Many Carvings, a place where Gormenghast keeps carvings from the minion types who have won the privilege of walking the parapets for once in their lives. It's a very strange sort of place, full of mystery, shadows, spider webs, and dust, and things like an attic that never quite hold their value, but they're too precious to give away. Chapter 3. Swelter. The chef of Gormenghast, balancing his body with difficulty upon a cask of wine, was addressing a group of apprentices in their striped and sodden jackets and small white caps. They clasped each other's shoulders for their support, their adolescent faces streaming with the heat of the adjacent ovens, were quite stupefied. And when they laughed or applauded the enormity above them, it was with a crazed and sycophantic fervor. As Mr. Flay approached to within yards of the cluster, another roar, such as he had heard a moment or two earlier, rolled into the heat above the wine barrel. The young scullions had heard this roar many times before, but never associated it with anything other than anger. At first, consequently, it had frightened them, but they soon perceived that there was no irritation in the note today. The chef, as he loomed over them, drunken, arrogant, and pedantic, was enjoying himself. As the apprentices swayed tipsily around the wine cask, their faces catching and losing the light that streamed from through a high window, they also, in a delirious fashion, were enjoying themselves. The echo died from the apparent reasonless bellow of the chief chef, and the sagging circle about the barrel stamped its feet feverishly, and gave high shrill cries of delight, for they had seen an inane smile evolving from the blur of the huge head above them. Never before had they enjoyed such latitude in the presence of the chef. They struggled to outdo one another in taking of liberties unheard of hitherto. They vied for favors, screaming his name at the tops of their voices. They tried to catch his eye. They were very tired, very heavy, and sick with the drink and the heat, but living fiercely on their fuddled reserves of nervous energy, all saving one high-shouldered boy, who throughout the scene had preserved a moody silence. He loathed the figure above him, and he despised his fellow apprentices. He leaned against the shadowy side of the pillar, out of the chef's line of vision. Mr. Flay was annoyed, even on such a day, the day the son of the Groan family is being born, by the scene. Although approving in theory, in practice it seemed to him that the spectacle was unpleasant. He remembered, when he had first come across Swelter, how he and the chef had instantly entertained a mutual dislike, and how this antipathy festered. To Swelter it was irksome to see the bony, straggly figure of Lord Supplecrave's first servant in the kitchen at all, the only palliative to this annoyance being the opportunity which it afforded for the display of his superior wit at Mr. Flay's expense. Mr. Flay entered Swelter's streaming province for one purpose only, to prove to himself, as much as to others, that he, as Lord Groan's personal assistant, would on no account be intimidated by any member of the staff. To keep this fact well in front of his own mind, he made a tour of the servants' quarters every so often, never entering the kitchen, however, without a queasiness of the stomach, never departing from it without a renewal of spleen. The long beams of sunlight which were reflected from the moist walls in a shimmering haze had pranked the chef's body with blotches of ghost light. The effect from below was that of a dappled volume of warm, vague whiteness, and of a gray that dissolved into swamps of midnight, of a volume that towered and dissolved among the rafters. As the occasion merited, he supported himself against the stone pillar at his side, and as he did so, the patches of light shifted across the degraded whiteness of the stretched uniform he wore. When Mr. Flay first had eyed him, the cook's head had been entirely in shadow. Upon it, the tall cap of office rose coldly, a vague topsail half lost in a fitful sky. In total effect, there was indeed something of the galleon. One of the blotches of reflected sunlight swayed to and fro across the paunch, this particular pool of light moving in a mesmeric manner backward and forward, picked out from time to time a long red island of spilled wine. It seemed to leap forward from the mottled cloth when the light fastened on it, in startling contrast to the chiaroscuro, and defying the laws of tone. This ungarnished side of Swelter's debauch, taking the swollen curve of linen, had somehow, to Mr. Flay's surprise, a fascination. For a moment he watched it appear and disappear, to reappear again, a lozenge of crimson, as his body behind it swayed. Another senseless bout of foot stamping and screaming broke the spell, and lifting his eyes, he scowled about him. Suddenly, for a moment, the memory of Mr. Rotcod in his dusty, deserted hall stole into his consciousness, and he was shocked to realize how much he had really preferred to this inferno of time-hallowed revelry the limp and seemingly disloyal self-sufficiency of the curator. He straddled his way to a vantage point from where he could see and remain unseen. From there he noticed that Swelter was steadying himself on his legs, and with a huge soft hand was making signs to the adolescent below him to hold their voices. Flay noticed how the habitual truculence of his tone and manner had today altered to something mealy, to a conviviality weighted with leaden sugar, and a ghastly intimacy more dreadful than his most dreaded rages. His voice came down from the shadows in huge wads of sound, or like the warm, sick notes of some prodigious mouldering ball of felt. His soft hand had silenced the seething of the apprentices, and he allowed his thick voice to drop out of his face. Gallstones! And in the dimness he flung his arms apart so the buttons of his tunic were torn away, one of them whizzing across the room and stunning a cockroach on the opposite wall. Close your ranks, and close your ranks, and listen most attentive some. Come closer then, my little sea of faces. Come ever closer in, my little ones. The apprentices edged themselves forward, tripping and treading on each other's feet, the foremost of them being wedged against the wine barrel itself. That's the way, that's the way, said Swelter, leering down on him. Now we're quite a happy little family, most select and advanced. He then slid a fat hand through a slit in his white garment of office, and removed from a deep pocket a bottle. Plucking out the cork with his lips, which had gripped it with uncanny muscularity, he poured half a pint down his throat without displacing the cork, for he laid a finger on the mouth of the bottle, so dividing the rush of wine into two separate spurts that shot adroitly into either cheek, and so making contact at the back of his mouth, down his throat in one dull gurgle, to those unmentionable gulches that lay below. The apprentices screamed and stamped and tore at each other in an excess of delight and aspiration. The chef removed the cork and twisted it around between his thumb and forefinger, and, satisfying himself that it had maintained perfectly dry during the operation, recorked the bottle and returned it through the slit in his pocket. Again he put up his hand, and silence was restored, save for heavy, excited breathing. Now tell me this, my stinching cherubs. Tell me this, and tell me extra quickly. Who am I? Now tell me extra quickly. Swelter! They cried. Swelter, sir, swelter! Is that all you know? Came the voice. Is that all you know, my little sea of faces? Silence now, and listen well to me, Chief Chef to Gormenghast, man and boy 40 years, fair and foul, rain or shine, and sand and sawdust, hags and stags, and all the rest of them, done to a turn and spread with the sauce of aloes and a dash of prickling pepper. With a dash of prickling pepper! Yelled the apprentices, hugging themselves and each other in turn. Shall we cook it, sir? Oh, we'll do it now, sir, and slosh it in the copper, sir, and stir it up. Oh, what a tasty dish, sir! Oh, what a tasty dish! Silence! Roared the chef. Silence, my fairy boys! Silence, my belching angels! Come closer here, come closer with your little creamy faces, and I'll tell you who I am. The high-shouldered boy, who had taken no part in the excitement, pulled out a small pipe of knotted wormwood and filled it deliberately. His mouth was quite expressionless, curving neither up or down, but his eyes were dark and hot with mature hatred. They were half closed, but their eloquence smoldered through the lashes as he watched the figure on the barrel lean forward precautiously. Now listen well, continued the voice, and I'll tell you exactly who I am, and then I'll sing to you a song, and you will know who's singing to you, my ghastly little ineffectual fillets. A song, came the shrill chorus. Firstly, said Chef, leaning forward and dropping each confidential word like a cannonball smeared with syrup. Firstly, I'm none other than Abiathus Swelter. which means, for you would not know, that I am the symbol of both excellence and plenty. I am the father of excellence and plenty. Who did I say I was? Abiathar Swelter, came the scream. The chef leaned back on his swollen legs and drew the corners of his mouth down until they lost themselves among the shadows of his hot dewlaps. Abiathar, he repeated slowly, stressing the central A. Abiathar. What did I say my name was? Abiathar, came the scream again. That's right, that's right. Abiathar. Are you listening, my pretty vermin? Are you listening? That's right, Abiathar, are you? The apprentices gave him to understand that they were listening very hard. Before the chef continued, he applied himself to the bottle once again. This time he held the glass neck between his teeth and, tilting his head back until the bottle was vertical, drained it and spat it out over the heads of the fascinated throng. The sound of black glass smashing on the flagstones was drowned in screams of approval. Food, said Swelter, is celestial, and drink is most enchanting. Such flowers of flatulence, such gaseous buds, come closer and steal in, and I will sing. I will lift my sweetest heart into the rafters, and will sing to you a song, an old song of great sadness, a most dolorous peace. Come closer in. It was impossible for the apprentices to force themselves any closer to the chef, but they struggled and shouted for the song and turned their glistening faces upward. Oh, what a pleasant lot of little joints you are, said Swelter, peering at them and wiping his hands up and down his fat hips. What a drippy lot of little joints. Oh, yes, you are, but so underdone. Listen up, cocks. I'll twist your grandmas so sweetly in their graves. We'll make them turn, my dears. We'll make them turn, and what a turn for them, my own, and for the worms that nibble. Where's Steerpike? Steerpike, Steerpike, yelled the youths, the ones in the front twisting their heads and standing upon their toes, the ones in the rear craning forward and peering about. Steer Pike, he's somewhere here, sir. Oh, there he is, sir, behind the pillar, sir. Silence! Bellowed the chef, turning his gourd of a head in the direction of the pointed hands, as the high-shouldered boy was pushed forward. Here he is, sir, here he is. The boy, Steerpike, looked impossibly small as he stood beneath the monstrous monument. I shall sing to you, Steerpike, to you, whispered the cook, reeling and supporting himself with one hand against a stone pillar that was glistening with condensed heat, little trickles of moisture moving down the fluted sides. To you, the newcomer, the blue mummer, the slug of summer, to you, the hideous and insidious and appallingly cretinous goat in a house of stenches. The apprentices rocked with joy. To you, only to you, my core of curdled cat bile, to you alone, so hearten diligentiums. Are you hearkening? Are you all listening? For this is how it goes. My song of 100 years ago, my plaintively most melancholic song. Swelter seemed to forget he was about to sing, and after wiping the sweat from his hands on the head of a youth below him, peered for Steerpike again. And why to you, my ray of addled sunshine? Why to you alone? Taking it for granted, my dear little Steerpike, taking it for more than for most granted that you, a creature of less consequence than stoat's blood, are so far removed from anything approaching nature, yet tell me, more rather, don't tell me why your ears, which must originally have been designed for fly papers, are, for some reason better known to yourself, kept immodestly unfurled. What do you propose to do next in this batter? You move here and there on your measly little legs. I've seen you at it. You breathe all over my kitchen. You look at things with your insolent animal eyes. I've seen you doing it. I have seen you look at me. You're looking at me now, Steerpike, my impatient love bird. What does it all mean, and why should I sing to you? Swelter leaned back and seemed to be considering his own question for a moment as he wiped his forehead with the sleeve of his forearm, but he waited for no reply and flung his pendulent arms out sideways, and somewhere on the orbit of an immense arc something or other gave way. Steerpike was not drunk. As he stood below Mr. Swelter, he had nothing but contempt for the man who had but yesterday struck him across the head. He could do nothing, however, except stay where he was, prodded and nudged from behind by the excited minions, and wait. The voice recurred from above. "It is a song, my Steerpike, to an imaginary monster, just like yourself. If only you were a trifle bigger, and more monstrous still. It is a song to a hard-hearted monster. So listen most fixedly, my pretty wart. Closer, closer. Can't you come a little closer to a dirgeous masterpiece?" The wine was beginning to redouble its subversive activity in the chef's brain. He was now supporting himself against almost the whole of the while against the sweating pillar, and was sagging hideously. Steerpike stared up at him from his high, bony brow. A cook's eyes were protruding like bloodshot bubbles. One arm hung, a dead weight, down the fluted surface of the support. The enormous area of the face had fallen loose. It glistened like jelly. A hole appeared in the face. Out of it came a voice that suddenly became weaker. "I am Swelter," it repeated. "The great chef Abiathar Swelter, cook to his lordship, board ship, and all sorts of ship that sail on slippery seas. Abiathar Swelter, man and boy and girls and ribbons, lots of kittens, 40 years of cold and sunny. Where's the money? Thick and thin, Harry, I'm a fairy, I'm a songster. Listen well, listen well." Mr. Swelter lowered his head downward over his wine-addled breast without moving his shoulders, and made an effort to see whether his audience was sufficiently keyed up for his opening chords, but he could make out nothing below him saving the little sea of faces which he had alluded to, and the little sea had now become practically obliterated from him by a swimming mist. "Are you listening?" "Yes, yes, the song, the song." Swelter lowered his head yet again into the hot spindrift, and then held up his right hand weakly. He made one feeble effort to heave himself away from the pillar and to deliver his verses at a more imposing angle, but incapable of mustering the strength, he sank back down, and then, as a vast, inane smile opened up the lower half of his face, and as Mr. Flay watched him, his hard little mouth twisted downward, the chef began gradually to curl in upon himself, as though folding himself up for death. The kitchen had become silent as a hot tomb. At last, through the silence, a weak gurgling sound began to percolate, but whether it was the first verse of the long-awaited poem none can tell, for the chef, like a galleon, lurched in his anchorage. The great ship's canvas sagged and crumpled, and then suddenly an enormousness foundered and sank. There was a sound of something spreading as an area of 7 flagstones became hidden from view beneath a cataleptic mask of wine-drenched blubber. Good stuff. There's hints to the character of Steerpike throughout this. It establishes him as a monster without actively saying he is a monster, but while also actively saying he's a monster, which, get your head around that, because he is the big bad of the series. The ultimate antagonist to Titus Groan and others. He's we don't know what he wants, but we know who he hates, and who he hates especially, and why. And of course, we'll get more from Steerpike as time goes on. Even though there's not much from Mr. Flay, we do know who Swelter is, who's kind of the first boss of this book. And enough description of the actions of, shall I say, the minion class of Gormenghast to be satisfied with how people act in the future, which is to say, they act like minions. It's a fascinating book, and I recommend it. It's worth reading for its own sake because the prose is often funny and beautiful. And even though you might not be able to do voices like myself, a good audiobook with voices is also exceptional. There's also a PBS version that you might want to see if you want. Either way, I view this as probably one of the best sort of introductions to character, to sort of the world around them, to antagonists that aren't like villains. Like they're villainous. Like Searpike is a villain. I want to say more like in a super villain sort of thing. They're not super villains. There's a fat chef with a cleaver. There's Steerpike for all his cleverness and all his crookedness, and that suffices for much of it. That's been a reading of Titus Groan by Mervin Peake.